Okay, well, let's begin formally. So welcome to all of you. I suspect that there are quite a few people with us already, but there'll be more joining. So I just want to thank all of you for joining us. This is our part of our weekly speaker series in the Division of Social and Transcultural Psychiatry. And within that rubric, we have a series of different themes: global mental health, culture and community mental health, which the talk today specifically falls under. We also have a series on culture, mind, and brain, and also on other aspects of cultural psychiatry. So what I want to do is just give a sort of a brief introduction. The framework for today is that we'll have about an hour for presentation and then about an hour for discussion. And if you have questions, thoughts, comments, please collect them as you're listening. You're free to put them in chat if you like, and we can go back and look at that. You also have a chance, depending upon how many people we have here, hopefully to to speak up directly. We do have well over 100 people who've signed up for this, so it may turn out to be a small air traffic control issue here. We'll see how that goes. So that's why I would encourage you to make some notes in the chat as we go along, so we can make sure that we pick up on some of the themes or questions that are going to be of broad interest to many of the people here. And I know that we have to, because we did send this announcement out beyond our local mailing lists, we have people from actually all over the world here today. So that's really quite nice. So later on, when you do have a chance to speak, please identify yourself and tell us where you're from. We can push back a bit against this virtuality. It's very nice that it sort of levels things out in the world. We're all connected, but we also risk losing a sense of place and even a sense of the richness of what's going on in these connections. So I'm delighted really to welcome today Professor Janis Jenkins from the University of California, San Diego, where she's Professor of Anthropology and Psychiatry. She's the founding director of the Center for Global Mental Health at UC San Diego, and she'll be telling us a little bit about that program. And she has really done path-breaking work in the areas of medical and anthropology, cultural psychiatry, psychiatric anthropology, this whole cross-cutting set of issues and concerns that bring mental health practitioners and social scientists together to better understand these forms of human suffering and efforts to address them. In particular, some of her early work on family dynamics and expressed emotion and psychotic illness stands as a kind of paradigmatic example of how we can understand the ways that cultural construals and explanations and modes of addressing mental health problems can really shape their experience, expression, and their course. And she's taken that kind of work that uses qualitative and ethnographic methods to get close to the lived experience of people and the challenges of making meaning out of suffering, to really deepen our understanding of the nature of mental health problems and of things that can be of help. So we're really excited to have her here. She's over the course of her career, in addition to very many seminal papers, she's edited some books and co-authored two. The edited book that she did early on with Rob Barrett on schizophrenia, culture, and subjectivity really, again, was a landmark for thinking about the experiential dimensions of a mental health problem in a way that tends not to be attended to when we turn experience into symptoms and signs and kind of proceed in that way. And then subsequent work on the pharmaceutical self and looking at the sort of political economy and cultural dynamics of psychopharmaceuticals. Her recent book in 2015, Extraordinary Conditions, Culture and Experience in Mental Illness, which collects some of her seminal work in this area. And then most recently with Thomas Chardash, Trouble in the Land of Enchantment, Adolescent Experience of Psychiatric Treatment, which is some of the work that she'll be talking about with us today. So thank you very much for being able to join us, Janis, and I'm happy to turn the session over to you.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Professor Kiermaier. We have been colleagues for some decades now in all the areas that he described in cultural psychiatry and psychological and medical anthropology, and really have taken seriously for, as I say, some time, this interdisciplinary work and team kinds of research and clinical approaches. So I will be directing a lot of my comments to that today. I think what I should do at this point is start sharing my screen. Yes, very good. Okay, so this is the flyer for this seminar, which you are all familiar with. What I'm going to do is take a few minutes, as Lawrence mentioned, and talk about the Center for Global Mental Health at the University of California, San Diego, and give you a sense of a range of the projects and the kinds of things that we're doing as a point of information in case anyone is interested, and then turn to one of the longer projects that we have completed one significant part of that is in this book, Troubled in the Land of Enchantment, and talk about that. All right, so this is the Center for Global Mental Health, which we've only been in existence since 2017. And as Lawrence mentioned, I'm a professor of psychiatry as well as anthropology. And so we have many colleagues within UC San Diego and other UC campuses, as well as beyond, that are collaborating with us on various projects. The website that we have for this, I'm going to just show you a few pages. You can take a look if you ever care to. This cgmh.ucsd.edu is the place to look. These are some screenshots I took last evening, just to give you a quick sense of it. What we're also trying to do, since we are all now in the pandemic, is look at the ways in which we have the intersection of COVID and mental health and neurological conditions, and the pandemic, along with the endemic of racism, as well as many other issues of structural violence. We have projects all over the world, about 21 of them right now, affiliated with our center. The lion's share are in Latin America, and particularly a couple of, well, really throughout Latin America, but I'm going to mention a couple that we have been doing and are continuing to do recently in the midst still of the pandemic. These are some of the news items that we have. Interesting, Dr. Ruth Shim from UC Davis recently resigned from academic psychiatry in a newsletter in Stat, actually that was last September, which I recommend. It's a short piece, but it's interesting. But we try to pay attention to items in discourse that relate to mental health and well-being. And here we have Alexandria Octavio-Cortez speaking on one item in which she was really verbally assaulted by a congressman. And I have to tell you, there's another one that is going to be put up soon where she's speaking out about the violence and the trauma that many of the congresspersons experienced and the aftermath of that from personal perspectives. She has this on Instagram now, but we're going to load it up. We also have sources of wellness. A lot of this comes from our work in psychiatry and how to handle this in collective as well as individual ways. And then also a section on lived experiences of COVID. Within the CDC, so problematic as it is, came out last March with some of the parameters for identifying it. We had significant problems with that and did a summary critique, but then have collected systematically curated sets of articles from all over the world about COVID in relation to mental health and well-being. Here is again a set of projects. These projects that are on child and adolescent mental health, as well as asylum seekers and refugees on the border, because we are 20 minutes from where I sit, away from the border. We have, which is the most highly trafficked land border in the Western Hemisphere, Tijuana and San Diego. It really is one continuous community. Many people live in Tijuana, but come to San Diego or UC San Diego for teaching, for work, for as students. So we have, so cross-border is, you know, had been until recently, you know, very, very common. And of course, we've had the travesty of what has gone on with asylum seekers under the regime of Trump. And we've been working with several different partners, international partners, local partners, primarily with healthcare providers to try to get a sense of several of these types of issues across these two projects, the child and adolescent one and the asylum seekers and refugee project that we have going on the border now. So that's just a little bit of background for you. So for those of you who may not be real familiar with the geography here, so here we are, San Diego, Tijuana, Las Cruces, which is where we conducted a good amount of the research that I'm going to talk about today. But in fact, we were all over the state, as I'll say in a minute, north of this part. But we've been doing studies and in fact have a postdoc now that is working out of Galveston all along the border, the southern border here between Mexico and the US in relation to mental health and well-being. These are just a few publications that have come out of some of that work, one of which is in Transcultural Psychiatry, as we all know, a premier journal, in which we published some work that we did in Mexico with high school students on the question of loneliness and among these youth and mental health. And then as you see over here, the final thing I have up along there in color, this particular book, which I'm going to talk about today. This was released in September of 2020 and is a 6-year study that resulted in the book that I'll speak. Whoops. I have this issue about the mouse getting away from me when I do this on online in seminars. This is the table of contents. We set the ethnographic stage for the environment, the local environment, as well as the history of clinical services for children and adolescents coming to the hospital, defining the problem, which I'll talk about a little bit from multiple perspectives, from the perspectives of the children or the adolescents who actually have these, have problems, from their parents, the providers, from multiple stakeholders. And then we have case studies of one angry boy and one angry girl to really look at this in depth. And then talk about the experience of psychiatric treatment across different settings, since we followed these kids and their trajectory across a variety of settings. And then get to the issue of having a life and what does it mean to have a life under the press of really, in large part, what we can call structural violence. Now, I have never done, since I was a graduate student some time ago, I've never done a project by myself, and I don't think that's likely to happen anytime soon. So these are some of the primary team members who are involved with this particular project, which was funded by the National Institute of Mental Health from the US. And as you can see, we have a very interdisciplinary mix of persons, psychologists. We have a child psychiatrist. They were involved with doing the research clinical assessments, the kids skid, which I'll talk about in a while. And we had medical psychological anthropologists and a great long list of research assistants. As I say, this study took 6 years to do, just in terms of all of the data collection and setting everything up, and then many years beyond that to get through the analysis and write-up. Okay, great. So what I'll do is give you an overview of the research and some of the conceptual orientations, the methods we used, a few of the findings, and the relevance to service and policy, and then we can have a discussion. The NIMH aims, as one needs to write up for the grant, and which we did in fact stick to pretty well, I think, is to look at the experience of psychiatric treatment from multiple perspectives, as I said, and how these problems, when they are defined as problems, and I don't think we have any cases in which there was anyone that did not think of this, whatever the situation was, as problematic. And we did a lot of this work. We were working in hospitals and in facilities that the kids were discharged to after they were in the psychiatric hospital for children and adolescents. Following them, but we recruited everyone from one hospital in particular, which I'll talk about in a minute. Now, I don't know how many of you have been to New Mexico. I'm going to guess a fair number of you. 2 years ago, we had the Society for Psychological Anthropology meetings, the society that now Lawrence is our current president for, and for which I've been a longstanding member, along with Society for the Study of Psychiatry and Culture. And when you, anywhere you go in New Mexico, when you enter the state, and everything is pretty much usually being in a car or a pickup truck, preferably, you see these signs, "Welcome to New Mexico." This is also emblazoned on all of the license plates in the cars in New Mexico. And I think that a lot of people go to the airport, and then maybe they go to Santa Fe, and they go and they see some beautiful places. And indeed, it is a beautiful place. This is a photo that I took of the Zuni Mountains, where I would go. We had a house that we were staying in. It was a long-term lease over some years that is in Gallup, New Mexico. And this is the highway that I would take to get to Zuni Nation, Zuni land. And this is a train that I would often pass. And this is, again, the Zuni Mountains. This is a map of the state. And as you can, oops, I really got to watch. Sorry. One of these years I'll get it. A map of the state. These blue arrows that you see here are the places where we went to interview the kids and their family members, primary caretakers, after they were discharged from the hospital in Albuquerque, where we initially met them. So if you, as you can see, this Las Cruces, this is, very near the border. We have about 360 high school students that we've done research with and assessed here that we have not even yet begun to get that work out and published. It's a non-clinical sample, but I'm going to, be talking about that at some other time, not today. Today is really talking about young persons who had significant troubles. But we had to drive all over the state. It's a little bit like being a road warrior, but out in the U.S. American Southwest, people drive long distances. It's not urban. This is a very rural kind of area. Albuquerque is pretty densely populated, but other than that, no other place is. Las Cruces is the second largest city within. Over here in the west, this is on the border of the Navajo Nation. That would be a different map superimposed here, but this is just to give you an idea of how spread out we were. This is one of the neighborhoods for one of the families. It's in Albuquerque that we went to. I'm going to just give you some visuals so you can get an idea. This is Albuquerque also. And it's a very, we use the word diversity so extensively in most of our everyday talk. There's New Mexico. The state of New Mexico is within the United States, one of the most culturally diverse. And I'm going to problematize that kind of language we're thinking later when we talk, to try to talk about hyper diversity and problematic issues in relation to culture and the way that people think about that. If you like Mexican food, and New Mexican food is not exactly the same as the kind of Mexican food that you can get in California, for example, but there's no shortage of really great stuff. This is Desert Sands Motor Hotel. This is kind of an iconic hotel on Highway 66. It's been used in a lot of films, popular with Hollywood. This no longer exists. It was boarded up, and it was about a year and a half ago, actually burned down and demolished. So even this no longer exists anymore. But this is part of an area that is called by locals, persons who live in the area, and many people who were in our study, the war zone. The city of Albuquerque Chamber of Commerce they became aware of that, and they renamed it the international zone. And you can see signs along the street saying international zone. But the reason it's called the war zone is because there is, high very high levels of poverty and despair, and also violence. This is further in the South. This is another one of the homes or the neighborhoods of the families that we worked with. This is a small intersection in northwest of Santa Fe, about 10 minutes out of Santa Fe, which I was on my way there to try to track down somebody who had been discharged from the hospital in Albuquerque and had been sent to a shelter in outside of Santa Fe. And right across the street, this is a tiny little intersection, I can't really show it, from this mural that you see here is this one. And there's actually a couple of these different signs here. So Trece, which is one of the major crime syndicates, gangs that exist with multiple subgroups across the Southwest and into Mexico. And there's two different major segments of it within California. Within Albuquerque, there are well over 400 self-identified gangs that work sort of like block by block. It's all very mapped out. So the conceptual orientations for the book that I'm going to talk to you about really are focused on the primacy of experience and cultural orientations as a starting point for ethnography. And we're interested in ethnography of sites of care and sites of harm, with the idea that there is no research without care. There can't be any research without care, without some, I just heard something. No research without care or recognition of suffering. And where, since in global mental health, we're interested in focusing on those regions and those areas in which care and attention is needed most due to the scarcity of resources, mental health care, all healthcare resources, poverty, racism, misogyny. We have put our efforts in these places, and also another kind of conceptual orientation for thinking about the materials that we got, the ethnographic and clinical and psychological and ecological kinds of data that we collected, is in relation to engaged struggle, which I'll talk about a little bit more. I began to think about a whole range of conditions across the various studies that I've done over the decades, with most of which have been funded by the National Institute of Mental Health, on two different levels. One, at the level of subjective experience of conditions of illness, disorder, or syndromes that are culturally and historically defined, what we as researchers and clinicians define as some kind of mental health or mental disorder. That personal experiential domain of problems defined in this way, that are produced by and reciprocally reproduced by conditions of structural violence, forced migration, ethnic discrimination and racism, social stigma, and the scarcity of resources. So that's the kind of a way that I thought of this. Now, this has got too many things on it, but will be very familiar to everyone within the division of social and transcultural psychiatry, we in our field, we have several decades of data, of empirical evidence to demonstrate the importance of all of these factors, cultural factors that make a difference to, I would argue, every aspect, however we define it, what level, what problem of mental health and illness that we could encounter. I've worked on several of these, including the bottom one, course and outcome. I'm very interested in what makes a difference for who gets better and who does not, and how is that, as well as Lawrence mentioned, subjective experience, meaning, etc. These are really very common anthropological baseline. How do persons conceive their world, problems, etc.? How do they experience them? Experience came in a little later into the field in terms of really being of paramount importance. But how do we, how do persons think about this from their own perspectives? How do we think about it? And then problematizing the ways in which those are different and how they can produce a kind of alterity. But what's really critical in my mind is that the way that problems are conceived, that which is of classic anthropological interest, is not only a basic science kind of interest, but it's also critical clinically for us to know, because it is vital to the socio-emotional response, how people respond to those things that they define in certain ways, and who gets better and how, and whether forces of care and support are mobilized or not. And the methods, as I already mentioned from outlining the team members for the project, are interdisciplinary. I forgot to mention some of the primary care physicians. We were working with all of the clinical care team within the hospital that we worked at, which again, I'll mention in a second. It's mixed methods, that standard thing that we say, was a whole set of a large number of procedures that we carried out with 60, which doesn't seem like that much, 60 persons, 60 youth and their families, and also their clinical care providers. In the end, since this was, we tried to do 1 to 2 year follow-up of, which is not that long, but it's not a one shot deal either. We were only able to get, by the end of the 2 year follow-up, 47 of those persons to follow through the full course of the study, because some of them we simply lost, or they moved too far afield. If they moved in any of the states immediately around New Mexico, we would go there. But if they moved back east, then it became too logistically difficult. And there were a few that we just simply lost. We couldn't find, despite very vigorous efforts to do so. This is a very problematic slide, which I show with some reservation, and that is this ethnic identity preference. These large categories, Anglo, white, Euro-American, and within New Mexico, Hispano, which is very different from Mexican and Latinx, Native American. We had persons from different nations who identify, pretty straightforwardly with, say, I am Zuni or I am Laguna, and African American, Chinese. But these I urge you to not take seriously, because they're so mixed as a matter of hybridity and And I talk about this in the book and really, try to deconstruct it. So it's too complicated for me to go into further right now. Simply to say, in terms of the age range, we had from 12 years old to 17 with a mean age of 14.7 for age. In terms of the, why were these youth hospitalized? Remember, the mean age 14.7 years, and the numbers of hospitalizations they had. For the vast majority of them, as you can see the yellow highlighted element there, this was not their first hospitalization. And many involved a suicide attempt or recurrent psych symptoms or encounters with legal system or police. This is a children's psychiatric center where we recruited the youth to participate. They had to agree to participate per all of the IRB protocol, as well as their parent or primary legal guardian. And this is the hospital, or it used to be called hospital. Then in the middle of the project, they changed it to center, associated with the University of New Mexico School of Medicine. Right across the street from this particular location is the School of Medicine for the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque. Now, for those 47 that we're summarizing, we talk about, what are some of the basic things I can tell you. We have the kinds of experiences and background they had and why were they in the hospital. Many had been the perpetrator of violent acts. And as you'll see, there's really very little difference between the girls and the boys in terms of having committed some sort of active violence. Suicide attempt is also very common and much more common among girls than the boys that we met. Although these numbers are relatively small, not an epidemiological study. This is an ethnographic and clinical cultural psychiatric study. Troubles with police, bereavement, also very common. Problem with drugs and alcohol. Interestingly, a lot of times we think of that as, well, that's more often associated with males. Not in our data. Again, numbers very small, but just simply not the case that it's more common for males. Self-cutting. Oops, I'm going to have to learn to control my mouse. It's just my one Zoom bad habit. Was very common, and we've written separately about that, and also more with a lot more elaboration within the book. Physical abuse and sexual abuse is, not uncommon within this group, and more common among the girls. But I would point to the main number of all the different, you look at the list of these types of problems, and there's, multiple, 4 or 5 of these different things that are concurrent. So that's descriptively what we would have to say about that. The KID SCID, we use the structured clinical interview for diagnosis for DSM-4, the KID version. This is a very rigorous research instrument that requires training for how to administer it, most of which were done in people's homes, not the hospital. How to score it. It takes many, many hours. And we had our child psychiatrist, Dr. McStork, who had worked on the res in the Navajo Nation and lived in the area for a long time, although he's been at the University of Washington for some time now. And then a clinical psychologist who's also trained in this. Mick was trained in New York and to do this, and Mary Bancroft, our clinical psychologist, was trained at UCLA and went through the whole. So these are, we have to have a really high bar of severity and number of symptoms to make criteria for these disorders. What you see here is this, it keeps recurring, this twice as common depression among the girls as opposed to the boys. And that is the most common kind of problem defined in this way as a psychiatric disorder. And anxiety and panic and substance abuse, note there's really not much difference between the girls and the boys. Again, numbers very small. And we did have more than I expected incidences of psychotic disorder that per the kids SCID data that we have. And then again, I bring to your attention the mean number of these. So the quote comorbidity or the concurrent number of problems defined per the SCID criteria is a lot. So I've always worked in the various studies that I've done to try to get the best research versus clinical, straight up clinical research diagnostic criteria for these categories, the DSM categories. And of course, for anthropologists, that can be a starting point, but never the end point. And many, as we know, probably the majority of medical anthropologists would just diss this outright as, flawed. You should never do this. But from my perspective, having just, a kind of sorting hat to try to look at different types of problems in the most simple descriptive way is useful. That said, I have never been more disenchanted with DSM categories than I have in this particular study for a variety of reasons, which I cannot detail, but I do talk about in the book and wrote it up. But there's, for kids that are 14 years old, 2 to 3 of these types of problems is a lot. Now, in terms of the experience of treatment, you see that I'm not going to use the audio clips which I have for these. I'll just summarize them really quickly. This is a young girl that we got to know pretty well. She had been in treatment, as most of all of the kids had been, way before we met them at CPH, Children's Psychiatric Hospital or Children's Psychiatric Center. It's referred to in both ways throughout the data since they changed the name. But the kids, the youth experience and the way that they talked about their treatment at CPH were, in an overall sense, I have to say to you, they were very positive. They would complain about, they would make us go to bed at 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock, and that was kind of mean to do, or they didn't like the food. Trust me, you wouldn't like the food. The food was not good, but their understanding of the care from the psychologists, the psychiatrists, and the social workers there, and the medical director there, I have to say, was really fabulous. He set the tone for the hospital and the experience of the families and the youth is that they really, since they had been in treatment in many places, that they had experienced this as a relatively good place for care or a good place to rest. And the psychotherapy was thought to help. And then what happened, because the study was ongoing for 6 years, was that the for-profit company, Value Options is the name, changed over to another one, Optum, and changed the criteria for which they would reimburse the hospital. And everyone at the hospital was very upset about how they changed things such that they had to close down 2 of the cottages or the small dwellings for where some of the kids were. They had to change the length of stay, and they had to change the type of care that they could provide because it wasn't ethically or clinically possible to do what they had been trying to do with far less time. And so this was a source of great frustration. And the families were noticing how everything was changing and evaporating, becoming unavailable. And it was a time of great strain. Now, unsurprisingly, the meds, psychopharm were very common. And as we know, all too often, the only kind of treatment that is available. And as we also know, and as we have written about, that it involves considerable ambivalence and ambiguity and creates paradoxes of lived experience. So while some persons may find them helpful compared to what their previous situation, it's not as though all is well. It is not, because people are very upset about it. People want cure. People want many things. The drugs are very limited and problematic in lots of ways that I'm sure most everyone here on the call is well aware. In terms of the mean number of psychotropic drugs that these kids, remember they're about 14 years old, had taken over the course of their lifetime, the type of drugs, almost 4 in these different classes of meds: antipsychotics, antidepressants, ADHD, the heavy antipsychotic. That's over the course of their lives. During the study, it was a little, only slightly less, about 2.5 drugs, still a lot of antipsychotics used. And now I'm going to turn to the narrative contrast in defining problems of the self and evidence-based care versus for-profit residential facilities, and show you how this contrasts in different settings in what I consider sites of care and sites of harm. Tatiana, we open the book with a narrative from Tatiana, who I met, and very slight. She's 14. She doesn't seem 14. She's very tiny, but mightily strong young girl. And we have a semi-structured interview guide of questions. I asked no questions. She was in charge of this narrative and began immediately by starting off with, I am Zuni. I come from the other side of the mountains. I come from Zuni. I came here because bad things happened to me. And some people told me I could come here to rest. This is my first time coming here or in trying to commit suicide. I hate myself because I hear voices, like voices telling me what to do, or hang yourself, do it, become like one of us. This was her opening narrative. This is the way she viewed things. She was in the hospital to rest, and because bad things had happened to her. Then she was at CPC for about 4.5 weeks, and then got discharged to a residential care facility, which has since been closed by the state for all kinds of violations. But she was in this unit, and this is what she said. This is about 5 months later. She says, "I'm here because I fucked up my life. I did it to myself. I can't really do anything right. I need to use my coping skills. Right now, I'm working on my depression, anger, hallucinations, and my self-harming. I have processed a lot of stuff, and I do coping skills. And I also call my mom, and that's her foster mom, if I need help." Now, if that isn't a neoliberal in stark contrast of a narrative defining the nature of the problem in relation to the place, it's hard to think of one more striking. The other conceptual orientation that we have for the book is a focus on struggle, because as I've thought about it, and I came to this when I was writing Extraordinary Conditions, and I had worked with a variety of different types of problems, types of conditions, including refugees fleeing, running for their life, persons experiencing extraordinary, spectacular hallucinations and suffering in a variety of ways. What impressed me the most about thinking about all the different studies and all the different types of problems was that symptoms were a very poor way to characterize or to capture what was most fundamental. What was most striking to me was that there was this struggle to get better, to try to improve. Not in all cases, as we know. Some struggles are failed. Some persons are resigned. But in my decades of research and experience, far, far greater numbers of persons, despite immense suffering over long periods of time and really, truly horrific situations and circumstances, they nonetheless remain not resilient, which I'm not so fond of that concept because it's too focused on the individual and not doesn't grab me as resonant for how I see what's really going on, this struggle. And we've thought that children can't really do this somehow because, well, children and adolescents can't do many things that adults do. And I think that's really false. We're finding that out more and more now with the current one study we're doing, a border study of 10 and 11-year-olds. It just depends. If you can talk to persons who are this age, really get them to tell their stories and get to know them informally, ethnographically, really different pictures emerge. So to wrap up with some comments and then open it up for discussion, I just would say that for the efficacy of services and treatment, which is really, I think, what everyone on the call here would agree is something that we wish to work toward. And this is not going to come as a newsflash to likely most of you either, but it's contingent on engaged partnerships with persons who utilize services, family, health policy, and very much a matter of political will for what matters. And what matters is lived experience, cultural meaning, and the struggle for well-being, healthy communities, etc. And I'm also arguing something that I've long been uncomfortable with since most of my career, I've worked with nearly all of it, Spanish-speaking peoples, immigrants, refugees with little formal education and great challenges economically, struggling with issues of racism and directed to them. This idea of wealthy and middle income and low income and global mental health is something that is, in the global South, or it's somewhere else. I'm arguing against that. I'm arguing instead that we prioritize regions and communities that are hard hit by forces of structural violence, and that scarcity and inadequacy of services are unacceptable everywhere for everyone, supposedly. Now, this has been revealed dramatically and horrifically with COVID, and how the United States has completely mishandled this. It is, as Tony Fauci says, our worst nightmare. The United States is not a recommendable place for adequacy of healthcare for the vast majority of our population. So with that, this is something that the press put together, the University of California Press, and a promo or propaganda. Their description of the book. We can stop there and open up for discussion.
So I want to, on behalf of all of us in our community and so on, I want to thank you immensely for this really, really rich and presentation and all the good stuff you've given us to think with.
Okay,
thank
terrific.
you all so much.
Wonderful.
Take care.
Bye-bye.